Susan had been Jane and Helen's friend for many years. They met through their husbands, who were executives at the same engineering company. They met at the gym twice a week and had lunch or coffee on other days. All three continued to work, but over the years they reduced their hours to part-time while caring for families that were now adults and scattered around the world, leaving three empty nests. Susan was 48 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulder-length blonde hair in waves and green eyes. The gym has helped her stay in shape, and over the years she has only gained a few extra pounds, which luckily concentrated on her chest, leaving her with a curvy figure, 38D 2836. She loved classic 50s films and favored vintage skirts, dresses, and jackets. She was a respected teacher, remained calm in crisis situations, and came across as someone who was always in control of the situation. Helen was 45 years old. Her black hair was cut fashionably, shorter in the back and longer in the front. She had an energetic, straightforward personality. Tall and naturally athletic, she took fitness seriously and maintained a 34B2634 figure. She owned investments in a number of companies in the field of beauty and cosmetics, loved fashion, constantly followed trends, and changed her style. Jane, the youngest of the friends, was a 44-year-old with long, curly brown hair that she styled in an endless variety of ways. She had dark brown eyes and the curviest figure, 40E3038. She was more reserved than her friends, but competent enough to hold a leadership position in HR and talent management. Her style was businesslike, pencil skirts and blouses, which she wore with heels. At evening events, she emphasized her curves and cleavage, secretly enjoying the attention it attracted. The girls' recent get-togethers took a shocking turn when it emerged their husbands were using their regular business trips and golf outings to hide years-long affairs with young female interns at the firm. This went on for years and only came to light when one of the new interns refused to be involved in such a relationship and filed a sexual harassment lawsuit. Now the company and the husbands were in complete damage minimization mode, trying to avoid publicity in the press. They met at Susan's to discuss their options. After months of denial, the husbands finally admitted some mistakes, although, after comparing the facts, the friends realized that not everything had been told to them. For each of them, the most likely solution seemed to be divorce. This was the last thing their husbands wanted. They begged and offered various solutions, from financial bonuses to emotional blackmail, pauses in relationships, travel around the world, living separately while maintaining a marriage, and even open relationships. Helen was furious. Matt is offering me an open relationship while he was having sex with blondes all these years while I was having children. Looks like I could sleep with the football team and still not make up for half of what he did. Jane approached the question more judiciously. I think we need to get maximum revenge, keep them on edge, use the case to our advantage, take the money, but leave all the options for ourselves. Susan asked what she meant by revenge, but Helen interrupted. Well, everything except murder, in my opinion, will be fair, but certainly financial and sexual. Sexual? Asked Susan. Absolutely. I now consider myself young, free, and unmarried. Okay, maybe not that young, but you get the idea. They laughed, which lightened the situation a little, but it brought up an issue that Susan and Jane hadn't even considered before: sex with other men. They continued to discuss this over several bottles of wine. Susan considered her options. God, the very thought of dating terrifies me again. It's too complicated and troublesome. I don't want to change my lifestyle. Helen, already quite tipsy, remarked. We just need sex buddies, young, fit guys with no obligations. You know what? Let's take a laptop and see who's there. After some hesitation, the others agreed, thinking it would at least distract them from the gloomy discussion. They quickly went to a dating site that Jane had previously helped a divorced friend use and began looking through profiles. Having fun discussing the merits of various men, they spent more than an hour doing this, accompanying their comments with frankly bold jokes. Surprisingly, it was Jane who suggested creating my own profile. She jokingly entered the name Susan Cougar, adding a rough description of her friend, including age, status, and purpose of the search. Jane found a photo of Susan on her laptop, cropped the background and face so no one could recognize her, and downloaded it. In the photo, Susan wore a revealing red dress with a plunging neckline. She only wore it once, realizing that it showed a lot more cleavage than she was comfortable with. After much debate and jokes, Jane hit the publish button and everyone burst into laughter. The next day, Susan woke up late with a terrible hangover. After drinking water, aspirin, and taking a shower, she felt a little better. As she began to put away the bottles and glasses left over from the night before, she noticed the laptop and remembered with horror about posting a profile on a dating site. She hurriedly opened it. The account login was still active. Memories of the events of the previous night began to flood into her mind. Susan was relieved to see that the photo still looked fairly anonymous in the daylight, although she winced again at how revealing the dress was. Her gaze fell on the number in the corner of the screen, which had increased from 130 to 131. After checking, she realized that this was the number of profile likes. Nervously, she clicked on a few comments. The first three read, "Absolutely stunning and so elegant. Would you like to get to know each other better, maybe on a date? Chris, 26. A wonderful figure, so glamorous, and at the same time married it's so piquant. I'm ready to become your lover at any time. John, 41. I wouldn't stop doing this for days on end. Richard, 21. Susan slammed her laptop shut, not knowing whether to laugh or panic. Panic still took over, but having calmed down, she was surprised to realize that she felt good, very good. Among everything else that was happening, this was an unexpected but pleasant boost to her self-esteem. She called her friends, briefly told them about the situation, and agreed that they would come to her place for lunch. When her friends arrived, Susan completely calmed down and was able to see the funny side of what had happened. She showed comments from Helen and Jane, who also thought it was quite funny, especially the more explicit ones. Jane noticed that many of these guys were very attractive. Susan and Helen had to agree. Upon closer inspection, most of them were between 20 and 30 years old. The number of likes has reached 256. Jane, ever the HR professional, suggested putting together a shortlist. After discussion, they agreed, deciding that this did not oblige them to anything. Jane explained that the site had filtering features and began using them. They checked working professionals first. Age became a point of discussion. Helen insisted that they did not want men their husband's age or older, which everyone agreed with. They discussed the peak of sexual activity for men in their 20s, but concluded that the early 20s were too young for them and noted the age range of 25 to 35, feeling a little risky about it. For physical characteristics, they selected the items sporty, athletic, and in shape. Jane hesitated before explaining that there was an option to filter by manhood size. Susan tried to persuade her to leave this item blank, but Helen was adamant. A long conversation ensued about what size would be ideal if there was a choice. They had a long discussion about their husband's limitations, coming to the conclusion that size did matter. Jane finally checked the 6 inches or more box before Susan could object again. The filter returned 37 matches. A quick check eliminated a few more due to appearance and profile elements they didn't like. Any hint of arrogance immediately led to expulsion. As a result, 17 candidates remained. They wondered what to do next. Once again, it was Jane who suggested sending messages to those shortlisted. Susan hesitated, pointing out that it was her profile. Helen noted that it could be any of them. The photo and profile were quite general, and either of them could refuse at any time. Meanwhile, Jane was already typing a message. "Hey, thanks for the response to my profile. I liked yours too. It would be great to chat and see how compatible we are." Susan frowned. "I'm not sure." "It's too late, I sent it," Jane laughed. Soon there were notifications of incoming replies. All 3 friends began to read the incoming messages with curiosity. Some of them were funny, most were relaxed, and some were a little weird. They responded to those they liked and became increasingly confident, while communicating in the secure environment of the site. They each had a favorite, so Helen suggested that they each continue to correspond with one of the men for the next week, and then they would decide how to proceed. Enjoying the conversation, all three readily agreed, including Susan. Susan chose Chris, 26, who was the first to respond to her profile. He turned out to be a competent, cheerful, and interesting conversationalist. After a few days of texting, they moved on to a more immediate chat and learned more about each other. They exchanged photographs, with Susan continuing to crop hers to remain anonymous. Chris suggested a video chat, explaining that it would prove they were real people and matched their profiles. Susan replied that she was married and did not feel comfortable showing her face. He suggested that she not show her face, just like in the photographs. Despite being a little nervous, Susan agreed, and they arranged a video call the next day at 7 p.m. Another stressful day of work proceedings has left Susan angrier than ever. Fortunately, her husband was away trying to resolve the situation. It wasn't until 6:30 that Susan remembered the video call with Chris. She quickly adjusted the laptop so that the camera would film her from the neck down, but it looked strange. She didn't like it, so she hurried to change clothes. To feel more confident, she put on her favorite skirt, sweater, and cropped jacket. She joined the chat feeling like a schoolgirl on her first day of classes. The video request from Chris came exactly on time. Unlike her, Susan could see Chris completely and was very impressed, finding him handsome and certainly in good shape. After the first greetings, they unexpectedly easily began the conversation, complimenting the details discussed earlier in the correspondence. Susan spoke honestly about her marriage and possible divorce. Chris was single after breaking up with his girlfriend last year, noting that he was not looking for a serious relationship. Chris took the opportunity several times to compliment Susan's figure, making her feel truly flattered. He asked if she was interested in meeting in real life or if she preferred to stay online. Susan hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure yet. Can we just see how it goes?" Chris replied that he thought she was amazing and would like to meet whenever she was ready. Susan again felt flattered, especially considering his attractiveness and the fact that he was 22 years younger than her. "If I can't see your face, is there a chance you'll take off that jacket?" asked Chris. Susan replied, "Was it a long way to see my breasts?" "Almost certainly," he answered immediately. Susan continued her banter. "What will I see in return?" "Whatever you want. Didn't your request mention abs?" Susan smiled as she typed out a message. "That's it, you're in." Taking off her jacket, she felt how tightly the thin sweater hugged her ample breasts. "Wow, gorgeous breasts. What size?" 38D if you're really interested, she answered, feeling herself blush. Looking up, Susan noticed that Chris had taken off his t-shirt. Now she could see his amazingly sculpted torso with perfect six-pack abs. It felt both wrong and incredibly exciting to her. "Very impressive. You must be training a lot." Chris continued to flirt. "Do you want to watch something else? Wasn't there a request in your profile for sizes larger than 6 inches?" Susan was stunned. If she had blushed before, now she was all ablaze, remembering this item in the questionnaire. Then she felt curious. This means that he is confident in himself. "Yes, I would like to see more," she replied. "No problem, but it will cost," Chris wrote. "What price?" "Well, I don't mean to be shy, but if you strip down to your underwear, it would give my anatomical friend all the motivation he needed." Susan froze, realizing how much this turned her on. "I think a little peek wouldn't hurt. I hope you enjoy the mature body," she wrote. Susan stood up and took a deep breath. She straightened the sweater out of her skirt and pulled it over her head, revealing a vintage red satin corset that barely contained her ample breasts. She then unzipped her tight skirt and pulled it down. Hearing Chris whistle, she revealed classic red satin French panties with garters holding up thin nude stockings. Chris was amazed. He couldn't believe how sexy Susan looked and became instantly horny. This was followed by whistles, exclamations, and compliments. Susan quietly rejoiced at his reaction, all her concerns about her mature figure disappearing amid the outpouring of his praise. "Now it's your turn," she wrote. Chris didn't hesitate. The clothes disappeared in the blink of an eye, and there he stood in front of the camera completely naked, showing Susan the biggest size she had ever seen. She couldn't take her eyes off him. Finally, she was able to write, "Oh God, this is impressive." "It's thanks to you, baby," Chris replied. Susan couldn't look away, completely immersed in what was happening. Chris began to touch himself gently, saying that he imagined her doing it for him. He then added that it could be perfect, emphasizing his fantasy with a slight smile. Susan felt herself overcome with excitement, trying to control herself and not give in to impulses. His confident words and soft, but insistent tone intensified her feelings. "I'm all yours whenever you want. Just let me know, and I'll be there," he said, looking at her with genuine desire. This comment brought Susan to a realization. She had just met this man. Feeling slightly uneasy, she politely wrote that she had to run, but would definitely contact her again. In fact, she needed time to think about everything and consult with her friends. Chris remained calm, sensing her doubts. "We can go at a pace that is comfortable for you, Susan. But before I go, can I see your face?" Susan had her doubts, and before the video ended, she leaned toward the camera and planted a kiss on the viewfinder. Chris only caught a glimpse of her face and a large imprint of red lipstick. The next day, the girls got together to discuss their progress. Susan was embarrassed to admit how far she had gone, but that quickly passed when Helen admitted that she had sparks flying with 25-year-old James, with whom she had several virtual sex sessions and even agreed to meet. Jane also got on well with Andy, a 32-year-old doctor, and was excited about the prospect of a date. They reviewed the men's profiles again, comparing notes and details of their chats. Susan shared her doubts about dating men in real life. Jane agreed that there was a safety issue even if the meeting took place in a public place. But sooner or later, they will be alone. "Unless we meet together, for example, invite them to one of us at home for a drink," Jane suggested. Helen, energetic as always, supported this idea. "Great idea. Let's call it the inaugural meeting of the Wives Club. We will all be there to support each other and make sure everything is safe. Well, add a little spice to our revenge plan." After much discussion, they decided to have a drinks party at Helen's the following Saturday. The husbands were still busy with work and preparing for court proceedings, and in any case, they agreed to spend this time apart. The guys willingly agreed to come, although at that time they thought that they would only meet the women they talked to. Susan was incredibly excited in the lead up to the party, playing out possible scenarios over and over in her head and discussing the details with her friends. On the day of the party, she received several messages from Chris, where he wrote that he was looking forward to meeting her. She decided to pamper herself with spa treatments, hair styling, and makeup at her club. Returning home, she thought about choosing an outfit. She wasn't sure how far it would go, but she wanted to feel sexy and impress Chris. She chose a black vintage 50s-style corset that flattered her figure and paired the garters with classic seam stockings. To this, she added a thong and a red dress from her profile, finishing the look with stilettos. After checking her appearance several times, she threw on a long coat and called a taxi to get to Helen. They agreed to meet at 6 in the evening, an hour before the men arrived. This was supposed to be an opportunity to support each other mentally and, more importantly, to drink a few glasses of wine. Susan was glad she had tried to look chic as both Helen and Jane looked stunning. Helen chose a blue evening dress that emphasized her slender figure and long neck. Jane chose a tight black pencil skirt and a cream silk blouse that hugged her curves. Her look was completed with leather boots that rose above the line of her skirt. Helen opened the door to the first guest, Andy, a few minutes before 7. He looked a little puzzled as he only expected to see Jane. He seemed relieved to see her, and they greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek. While she was greeting him, Chris and James arrived, also slightly confused. Helen kissed James on the lips, holding the kiss a little longer than usual. Susan greeted Chris, which was the first time he could actually see her face. She wondered what he thought of her, but her doubts were dispelled when he complimented her, saying that she looked even more beautiful than he could have imagined. Susan blushed, replying that he looked great too, and took a moment to look him over. He wore tight black jeans and a sheer white linen shirt that showed off his impressive figure. The wives explained the whole story over the first glass of drinks. The conversation was conducted in a general tone, but each of the men was still more drawn to his online partner. Men did not skimp on compliments, noting how stylish and elegant the women looked. The wives, accustomed to social occasions, skillfully carried on the conversation, especially thanks to the fact that Helen quickly filled glasses. The profile created for the three wives required some clarification, and at one point Andy asked the question. So, just to clarify, are we meeting people we've been texting with, or is this some kind of club and we can change? Susan was about to confirm that everyone stayed with their interlocutor, but Helen answered first. Well, actually, it's a kind of wives' club. So I suggest we start with those with whom you have communicated, and then we will see how we feel. I hope this becomes something permanent and enjoyable for all of us. This option had not occurred to Susan. She expected the evening to start with drinks and then spend time with Chris. However, now she couldn't help but look at James and Andy in a new way. It was slightly unsettling, but at the same time very exciting. Jane broke the silence. What do you guys think about all this? This probably comes as a big surprise to you. We are older, we are married, and we have thought of everything in advance. We understand that meeting all three of us at once may seem strange. Chris was the first to respond. All three of you are incredibly beautiful. I'd like to get to know Susan better, but if it leads to something else, I'd be perfectly happy. James and Andy quickly agreed. James added that he was ready to offer his services to any of the wives, no matter how much they wanted, and Andy assured that he was ready for anything. Helen continued. Well, since we are talking about the club, I suggest that each of the wives sit down with the gentleman she chooses. She volunteered to go first, but surprised everyone by unexpectedly unbuttoning her blue dress and letting it fall to her feet. Underneath the dress was an electric blue bra and panty set that, along with heeled sandals, showed off her endlessly long legs. She made a small turn and walked in front of the three men, as if choosing who to sit with, and then suddenly plopped down on Chris's lap. Relax, Susan, I'm only joking, she said. She then kissed Chris on the cheek and moved on to James. James did not hesitate and immediately kissed her, which the others watched in surprise. Helen finally broke away from him and suggested that Jane's turn should go to him. For a second, it looked like Jane might refuse, but then she stood up and began undoing the buttons on her blouse. She pulled it out of her skirt, revealing two huge breasts, barely contained by the satin bra. She unbuttoned her skirt and tried to pull it down, but it got stuck on her curvy hips. Andy had to help, and eventually the skirt slipped down to reveal matching satin panties and boots that ended just above her knees. Should I leave my boots on or take them off? Jane asked. Of course, leave it, Andy replied. Jane walked over to Andy, boots clicking loudly on the floor, and sat on his lap, almost drowning his head in her ample breasts. Now it's Susan's turn. She stood up nervously, feeling all five eyes on her. Taking a deep breath, she moved slightly to the beat of the music in the background, lifted the hem of her dress to expose her thigh, and asked Chris to unzip her. She stood with her back to him and slowly pulled off her dress, turning over her shoulder. This exposed her corset, garters, and seamed stockings. She swayed her hips before turning and doing the same to her bust, which was accentuated by the corset. Susan pushed Chris onto the couch and sat on his lap. As soon as she did this, he hungrily kissed her on the lips. Each couple quickly became engrossed in some heated kissing and touching. Men discovered new pleasures by studying the half-naked bodies of mature wives. Jane was the first to interrupt what was happening. I think it's fair for the wives to see what our gentlemen have to offer. Everyone needs to undress. The men, as if on cue, stood up and began to take off their shirts, revealing their toned torsos. Then they took off their shoes, jeans, and underwear. The wives silently examined what was swinging in front of them. All three men turned out to be much larger than their husbands. Helen commented. Looks like we're in for a difficult evening, girls. Jane, you said 6+ inches in your profile, not 7, right? Well, we are all experienced married women. I think we can handle it. Chris replied. I'm sure your husbands can't stand it for long, but today everything will be different. We are young, in shape, and ready to repeat again and again for hot cougars like you. It's going to be a long and fun night. Helen interrupted the pause again. Ladies, I suggest we head to our bedrooms. We'll meet here in an hour. With that, she stood up, picked up James, and led him into her bedroom. Andy stood up with Jane, gallantly kissed her hand, and they walked hand in hand to the other bedroom. Chris walked up to Susan. He picked her up and kissed her passionately so that she felt his arousal on her thigh and her breasts pressed against his body. Can you show me the way, Susan? Her thoughts were still racing between her family and her husband, but surprisingly, she felt no guilt, only slight anxiety about what awaited her. She was brought back to reality when Chris spanked her buttocks outside the bedroom door. The blow was not painful, but it took her by surprise. Chris smiled as he closed the door behind them. This is not the only surprise that awaits you today, Susan. An hour later, Helen joined Susan and Jane in the kitchen. All three looked disheveled. Their hair was disheveled. Their makeup was slightly smudged. Well, what are the results? Helen asked, but before anyone could answer, she continued. James is simply incredible. He is tireless, and I lose track of the time we are together. This is something completely new to me, and I feel on cloud 9. I think I'm in love. Or is it just a strong attraction? Anyway, this is one of the best experiences of my life. How are you? Jane replied. Andy is very attentive and gentle. He is a true gentleman and always strives to do everything perfectly. The complete opposite of James. With Andy, it took a little longer for everything to come together, but in the end, everything worked out great, even though I was tired. And you, Susan? It seems like you were the most indecisive of the three of us. Chris is quite cocky, uses rude language, and likes to spank. We did this for an hour without a break, and he declared that this was just the beginning. Can't wait for the sequel. And I was delighted. It was amazing. He is the ideal lover, confident but not smug. He has a gorgeous body, and he also makes you feel like a goddess. I have never had such pleasure from sex. It was a real revelation. So the evening went with a bang, Helen announced and continued. I suggest we return to our partners and continue the fun. And tomorrow we will decide whether we want to repeat this and perhaps exchange partners. The main thing is not to let your feelings go too far and not fall in love. Raising her glass, she declared, for the first night of our wives' club. May there be many more nights like this. The next day, the friends met at Jane's to discuss the first night of the wives' club. Before sharing details, Susan asked how each of them was feeling and whether they wanted to continue. Their opinions turned out to be surprisingly similar. Each of them experienced a night of unbridled passion without the ties and routine of family life. They were surprised by the lack of guilt and how exciting it was. They were delighted with how the young lovers were turned on by their initiative. All three were professional, courteous, and also had a chic appearance, outstanding endurance, and impressive advantages. The decision to see each other again was unanimous. Helen suggested changing partners to avoid becoming too attached to one. Jane liked Andy, but she was also interested in James and Chris, and, to her surprise, agreed with Helen. Susan was hesitant because she did not know the other two men. As a result, Jane suggested arranging a double date in a cozy bar, where she would introduce Susan to Andy and she would meet James. Helen, meanwhile, will arrange a meeting with Chris. Susan agreed to a date next Saturday. At this point, Helen noticed that her husband Matt was trying to call several times. After checking their phones, Susan and Jane found many missed calls from their husbands. Something happened. They didn't pay any attention to us, completely focusing on the court case, and now there are so many calls. It's strange, don't you think? Jane commented. Susan agreed to call her husband Rob back and put her on speakerphone. The conversation turned out to be cold and strange. He was overly apologetic and acted even more contrite than when he initially confessed to the affair. He was too nice, which made Susan feel uneasy. Jane and Helen had similar conversations with their husbands, full of requests for reconciliation. The next week became the most hectic of Susan's life. The very next day, each of them received a call from the law firm representing the interests of their husband's company and were invited to a meeting. The friends agreed to meet together. On Tuesday morning, they arrived at the firm's offices, where they were greeted by a whole team of lawyers. Initial discussions were vague and evasive, but focused on finding out whether the wives would support their husbands during the proceedings. They also hinted that it would be helpful if they confirmed their husbands' alibis for certain dates, or, if they were unsure, simply stated that they didn't remember anything. Susan was furious, but controlled herself. She knew that both Jane and Helen used electronic calendars to plan family and work matters, including their husbands' trips. All the wording sounded legally cautious, but it was obvious that they were almost being asked to lie, or at least hide the truth. Jane was the first to react, seeing an opportunity to discover the extent of her husband's infidelity. Calmly, she asked, "What dates exactly?" The lawyer, looking impeccable, pushed the folder towards her. Jane opened it. "Oh God, there are hundreds of dates here." "Yes, it covers a long period of time," the lawyer replied. "We believe that some of the allegations may be false." Susan felt dizzy. Time coverage made everything worse. This went on for years, beginning in what she considered the happy first years of marriage. Helen, who had been unusually silent up to this point, answered for everyone. "We will, of course, need to check the dates and let you know later. In the meantime, there is one more issue. Matt has begun transferring our assets, and as you understand, this is completely unacceptable, not to say illegal. Given the financial risks he has exposed us to, we demand that all assets be immediately transferred to our names. If this happens, any potential divorce proceedings may be delayed." The lawyers started buzzing at once, but Helen interrupted them, saying, "Gentlemen, this meeting is over," and she resolutely left the room. Susan and Jane followed her, trying not to show their surprise. They didn't speak until they were outside. The first topic of discussion was dates. There were a lot of them, and they covered a significant period of time. Jane checked the last dozen on her phone. All the dates coincided with conferences and trips that their husbands were attending. The women discussed whether the infidelity could have been so extensive. Susan had a feeling she wouldn't like the answer, and if it was true, then their entire years of marriage had been built on lies. "They basically asked us to lie, which means they are really worried. I wonder if they want us to testify, or if they are trying to prevent us from testifying against them. If they all get divorced, it will look bad." "Helen, where did this asset request come from? Is Matt actually transferring money?" "Honestly, I don't know for sure, but it's his style. He has not tried to withdraw anything from the main accounts or change the house's registration to himself, but he does have at least 2 other accounts. I left this meeting to give us time to think. We all need to keep track of our finances and perhaps hire lawyers." After a lively discussion, the women agreed to postpone decisions until the next day and meet at Jane's. Events took an even more unexpected turn when a representative of the plaintiffs contacted Helen and suggested they meet. This prompted a series of confusing calls, which resulted in the women agreeing to meet with the representative and lead plaintiff, Michelle. They gathered at a hotel in the city center. The representative was already there and said that he had arranged for Michelle to arrive in half an hour. He stressed that he was working independently, and this would be a one-time meeting that might help answer their questions and also allow him to understand their position. He noted that more than 18 victims have already been identified and more are expected. The case was very strong, and he made it clear that they had evidence to back up the dates and locations. It was obvious that he was testing whether wives were willing to support their husbands or testify against them, while hinting at the possible consequences of any false statements. The conversation continued when an attractive brunette in a formal suit with a dark blue skirt approached their table. Jane guessed she was perhaps 23. She seemed a little nervous, but remained composed and confident during the somewhat tense introduction. To Susan's surprise, Michelle did not tell her story but invited questions. There were a lot of them. Initially, the conversation was choppy and tense, but as Michelle shared details, the conversation became more relaxed. What they heard was a sobering account of their time at the company, leaving no doubt about how coercive and oppressive their husbands' actions were towards the young female interns. It was the subtle details and recognizable phrases that their husbands used in everyday life that made the story so compelling. The fact that it was so difficult for women to pursue careers in engineering magnified the influence they had. Dismissal was not an obvious decision given the importance of the references and close connections with other firms. It could end a career and years of study and preparation. This was confirmed by the fact that Michelle was no longer working in engineering. She eventually filed a complaint, but was fired a week later for poor performance. She confirmed that she collaborated with several other victims who had similar stories. The wives exchanged glances as Michelle spoke, each of them increasingly convinced that her story was true. Helen was struck by how reasonable and collected Michelle was, thinking that only such a person could decide to make an accusation against several senior colleagues. Their original plan of not saying anything fell apart. Susan thanked her for deciding to talk to them, and all three emphasized that they had no idea that this could happen. They asked about her future plans, but she replied that for now she was only thinking about completing the case and was going to return to her hometown. The thought of what she had to go through made Jane especially angry. She found it difficult to accept that the protections and policies that should have prevented similar incidents decades ago were ineffective, and that the entire senior team at the company was complicit. The representative concluded the meeting by emphasizing that he only wanted to acquaint them with the facts of the case and did not ask them to take any specific action other than telling the truth. After a busy week, Susan had the luxury of preparing for her double date with Jane. She enjoyed getting her makeup done and her hair done at the salon after a little retail therapy. She slowly got ready, feeling great in an open, crisscross fit and a matching black bustier. The grace was complemented by garters, which she attached to Cuban seam stockings. She loved the way the retro lingerie accentuated her figure under the satin skirt. After some hesitation, she dared to wear the sheer black blouse she had bought earlier that day. After finishing her preparations with Coco Mademoiselle perfume, she was ready for the evening. Susan walked into the bar James suggested on the outskirts of town at 7 p.m. James and Andy were already there and chatting. They both commented on how amazing she looked and repeated it when she took off her jacket. She noticed that both looked at her top, which pleasantly flattered her vanity. Andy bought her a vodka tonic, and they all sat in a booth to wait for Jane. The conversation flowed easily, dispelling her fears about meeting them. As they were looking at cocktails for round two, Susan decided to call Jane. She answered only the third time, apologizing for not being able to come. The gist of the explanation was that her husband had upset the children and blamed her for not living at home anymore. It was clear that she would need time to sort everything out and would not be able to come. Susan relayed the conversation to the boys and apologized, especially to James, who had been assigned as Jane's date. He offered to stay for a few more drinks if no one objected, since he was already here and having a good time. They continued trying cocktails. The guys remained charming conversationalists, and Susan felt the conversation flow naturally. Some of the conversation took on a slightly frivolous tone. Susan asked questions about the guys' ex-girlfriends, and they, in turn, were interested in her sexual preferences and, with a smile, clarified her parameters, including her breast size 38D. Susan was not used to alcohol and was beginning to feel slightly intoxicated. The lights in the bar were dimmed as the band started playing. She quickly became popular with the locals who filled the dance floor. James asked Susan when was the last time she danced. She had to think about it, but she couldn't remember. Shrugging her shoulders, she admitted it. Then he noticed that there was no better time than now, took her hand and led her to the dance floor. Despite the drink, she felt a little insecure, especially since her bustier was visible through her top. By focusing on the music, she found a rhythm and began to relax and enjoy herself. Looking around, she realized that everyone was too busy with their own affairs to pay attention to her and James. She noticed how James's gaze lingered on her breasts, which unexpectedly excited her pleasantly. After a couple of tracks, Andy replaced James, which was logical because he was her date. He moved well, dancing much closer to Susan, sometimes touching her. They enjoyed a few more songs. Halfway through the third, Andy moved closer, put his arm around her waist, and their chests touched as he leaned in to kiss her. She responded by kissing him passionately. No one seemed to notice, and they went back to dancing. During the next song, Susan felt someone grab her hips from behind. Turning her head, she saw James. He moved to the beat of the music, pressing himself against her buttocks and kissing her neck. When she turned her head, he kissed her on the lips. Her thoughts were racing, but after breaking the kiss, James remained close behind her, and she felt his arousal. Her worries about Andy's reaction dissipated when he came closer, pressing his arousal against her stomach, and kissed her again. Susan looked around, worried that people might notice, but that fear ruined the magic of the moment, and she quickly left the dance floor, returning to the booth. Andy and James followed. She blushed and apologized for being too carried away by the music and alcohol. They both laughed, saying that there was nothing to apologize for. If anyone should, it would be them. They added that everything happened naturally and even excitingly. Andy continued, "Actually, instead of apologizing, I would like to continue. I'm your date, Susan, but I don't mind sharing you at all. You've got us very excited. Do you think you can handle both of us?" Susan nearly choked on her drink. "I've never done this before. I don't even know where to start." James added, "You started a few hours ago when you put on that top and let us enjoy the view of your amazing breasts. Imagine how we kiss them and you become the center of our attention. I live very close. You can walk in 5 minutes." Susan's slight panic was overcome by incredible excitement. Without the experiences of this week, she would have rejected the idea, but now she was overwhelmed by the desire to live in the moment. "Okay, I agree, but I decide what happens and what doesn't, and I will stop if I feel uncomfortable," she replied. Andy nodded. "Of course, Susan, that's how it should be. But can I ask? Take off your bustier in the toilet and walk to James' house in just your blouse. You can cover yourself with a jacket at the bar. I'd love to see them wiggle." "Pervert," Susan laughed and headed to the toilet. A few minutes later, she returned wearing a jacket and handed something to Andy, who was already smiling. He took her by the arm and led her out of the bar, James following behind them, examining her legs in stockings with seams that reached the garters under her skirt. Once around the corner, Andy stopped and kissed Susan. In the process, he unbuttoned and removed her jacket, revealing her ample breasts in a thin mesh blouse. After the kiss, he moved aside and James continued, kissing her even more passionately. His chest pressed against hers and his hands slid down to feel her hips and garters. They walked on, holding Susan's arms on both sides. Her high heels clicked on the sidewalk, and she heard the soft rustle of her satin skirt against her stockings, but she was much more aware of her breasts bouncing under her sheer blouse. They passed a young couple who were staring at Susan, particularly at her exposed breasts. Instead of being embarrassed, she lifted her chin and stuck out her chest, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Andy whispered, "Wow, well done. It turned out stylish." When they got back to the apartment, Susan sat down on the sofa with James and Andy on either side of her. There was a slight tension and excitement in the air. They were still under the impression of the previous evening. Susan looked thoughtfully at the two young men, realizing that she was attracted to them in their own way. She liked their confidence, their open interest in her, their willingness to communicate without unnecessary conventions. She looked from one to the other, thinking about how their future relationship would develop. Maybe you should make a choice in favor of one, or let things take their course. In these moments of reflection, Susan felt truly free. She had no obligations, only sincere interest and sympathy. "You know, guys," she said quietly, trying to hide a slight smile, It seems that I'm the only one here who has already relaxed. Maybe you two can become a little more frank. I want to see you as you truly are." They exchanged knowing glances and, standing up, took off their outerwear without haste, remaining in light shirts and trousers. Susan watched them with interest, noting their toned figures, but not at all embarrassed. She liked their openness, lack of lies, and desire to hide something. She smiled slightly, feeling a moment of strength and self-confidence. Unbeknownst to herself, Susan had already stopped thinking about anything in particular. She simply enjoyed the presence of two handsome men, their attention and readiness for open, honest communication. She liked this contrast, light irony, warm glances, and the soft touch of their voices to her consciousness. "You are so different and so real." "It's captivating," Susan admitted, looking into their eyes. It seemed that for her these minutes in the spacious living room meant more than any lush romance or long conversations about feelings. She was fascinated by the very fact that she had the opportunity to be herself, not embarrassed by her desires, without crossing the boundaries of reason. If Susan had hoped to rest, she was mistaken. Andy noticed her look and said, "We're just warming up, Susan, and we can continue all night. But I'm sure an experienced woman like you can handle it." Susan really wasn't sure if she could handle it, but after recovering from her excitement, she felt a strong desire to continue. James seemed to understand her mood. "Now I would like to spend time with you, Susan." With these words, he carefully laid her down and began intimacy in a classic position. Their interaction was deep and intense, James enhancing the moment by supporting her legs on his shoulders. Susan enjoyed the gentle touch of his hands, which gave her confidence. What followed was one of the most intense and memorable moments of her life. Watching Andy sit in a chair and quietly maintain the atmosphere added an extra layer of excitement. She seemed to create a special atmosphere for both him and James. Both men shared compliments about her attractiveness and ability to create a special atmosphere. Previously, Susan might have perceived such words as a modist, but now they only increased her excitement and aroused a feeling of pride. She heard her own pleas and sounds of pleasure, completely immersed in the moment. James continued to guide the process carefully, controlling it and waiting for her emotions to peak before ending their time together. Luckily for Susan, they took a break. James found some refreshments, and the pause allowed her to process her feelings. She didn't feel guilty about her marriage, but she did feel a slight embarrassment at being part of such an intimate moment that could only be described as passionate and exciting. However, feelings of elation and liberation prevailed. She had never experienced anything like this and enjoyed it. Perhaps they could be seen as using her, but she knew she was doing the same. And he wondered if she had doubts now that the initial excitement had died down. He asked if she was okay and if she wanted to continue. Susan thought and smiled. "Yes, everything is fine with me, and I will happily continue to maintain our connection." "What's next?" James replied. "Every meeting should be a special pleasure. Get on all fours, Andy will take care of you, and you will interact with me as before." Susan didn't think twice about it. She rolled over onto all fours and waited, her movements smooth as she felt two pairs of strong hands caressing and supporting her. "Ready for the next step, Susan?" "I hope so, because we have at least 4 of them." Susan thought it was going to be a very long night. The months leading up to the hearing were tense for all parties. The wives' threats to file for divorce and refusal to testify, along with hiring their own lawyer, led to the securing of their assets and the discovery of additional investments and accounts that their husbands had hoped to hide. The case was referred to an employment tribunal with the possibility of further criminal and civil proceedings. No doubt concerned about the scale of possible compensation and the loss of reputation, the company continued to support the 3 husbands. All 3 wives were named as defense witnesses and attended the hearing on the first day. What happened at the same time caused chaos. Each of the husbands was given divorce papers. Alarmed, the company's lawyers learned of the wives' intention to testify truthfully, including the fact that their husbands were on business trips together on all the dates indicated. At this point, everything started to fall apart. Lawyers asked for a delay to consider new evidence, but the case quickly collapsed. The company wasted no time in distancing itself from the husbands, declaring ignorance of their actions. In light of the wives' testimony and the growing number of plaintiffs, the husbands were fired for gross misconduct. The company immediately began to settle the claims, and the likelihood of criminal prosecution increased significantly. The legal fallout was still being worked out 2 weeks later when Susan agreed to meet with Chris for a drink. She liked the idea of a date and took the time to prepare and choose retro clothes. She settled on a tight red dress with a deep neckline. Heels and perfume completed her look. They met at 7 and enjoyed a few quiet drinks. Susan put a ban on discussing husbands, courts, or divorces and enjoyed a relaxing evening in good company. They chatted easily about what each of them was doing and what they were going to do in the future. This relaxation came to an abrupt end when her husband Rob burst into the bar. Tall, about 190 centimeters, and weighing 100 kilograms, he was hard to miss, and he was clearly drunk. He immediately noticed Susan, walked towards her with rage in his eyes, and, standing tall, began to shout, "You damn bitch, you destroyed me. Because of you, I was fired and blacklisted." Susan stood up and replied, "I think you did it yourself." Rob, "It was just a little prank, no one was hurt." Susan, "As always, self-pity and caring only about yourself without thinking about the victims or family." Susan tried to continue, but Rob launched into a drunken tirade. "You're sitting here so important, dressed like a girl of easy virtue. You're getting ready to have sex with your boy. It's disgusting. He's fit to be your son." The barmaid noticed what was happening and said she was calling the police, to which Rob stated, "She's a prostitute, but she's still my damn wife, so you can shut the hell up." Chris tried to take Susan away, but Rob wasn't going to let that happen. He grabbed her hand and shouted, "She will come with me." Chris replied, "Calm down, let's talk." These words only angered Rob even more. He was beside himself. "You better get lost before I kick your ass." Chris did not move from his place and calmly continued, "She won't leave with you unless she wants to." Rob roared, "One more word and you're dead, puppy." Although Chris worked out in the gym, he was never a fighter. Like most working-class guys, he had his fights, winning some, losing most. His main lesson from fighting was simple: don't wait to get hit. This was not the most useful thought, since to strike first in such a situation would automatically mean becoming guilty. Chris's thoughts were rudely interrupted by Rob, who rushed at him with his entire massive figure. He saw Rob's huge fist moving in slow motion. Chris managed to step aside and avoid a blow that would probably have knocked him out. As soon as Rob flew by, Chris accelerated him by pushing him, causing him to crash into the bar stools and crash to the floor. He was clearly out of breath. "Rob, take a breath and calm down," Chris said. But the rage gave Rob strength, and he rose again. "Damn," Chris thought and tried to dissuade him. "You're a big guy, but a little out of shape. Why don't we?" Before he could finish speaking, Rob stepped forward again and struck with his right hand, but this time he kept his balance. However, the blow was weak. Chris blocked it and immediately punched Rob in the stomach. He exhaled loudly and bent in half. A few seconds later, Rob began vomiting, earning mocking approval from the crowd at the bar. Susan took the moment to grab Chris's hand and drag him away from the bar. They hailed a taxi and Susan checked to make sure Chris was okay as she got in, apologizing for dragging him into this. Chris sincerely responded that it wasn't her fault, and he was just glad she wasn't alone. "You were so calm and collected, my savior." Chris shrugged it off, knowing that this was far from the truth. "I wouldn't say. Rob was just drunk." Susan responded, "You are sure? A hero has the right to demand any reward." Chris, smiling, "Oh, well, in that case, yes, definitely a hero." "Well, almost a hero." Susan laughed. "Then it's decided. If only you are satisfied with a married pervert bitch." Chris, "No, but I completely agree with the cool, beautiful lady next to me." Susan with a smile, You're just perfect, right? Cool or not, I'm going to sleep with you today. They started kissing and didn't stop until the taxi arrived. Having quickly paid, they hurried into the house. It was as if all of Susan's fantasies had come true, as if she were in a classic 50s Hollywood movie, playing the damsel in distress who is rescued by a fearless young hero. She couldn't get Chris's clothes off fast enough. As soon as they entered, she reached for him with such fervor that Chris felt dizzy. Her confidence and passion were mesmerizing, leaving behind any thoughts of restraint. He looked at her with admiration, not believing how such sensuality and sophistication could be combined in one woman. She looked up at him, and everything was visible in her eyes: excitement, audacity, and the desire to make this moment unforgettable. Everything happened with such intensity that Chris barely had time to realize how much he was attracted to her. Her lips were bright red, and her movements were precise and filled with fire. When he felt that he had reached the limit, he tried to say something, but the words were lost. Her determination and passion left him completely exhausted, giving him moments of pure delight. Susan finally came up for air, gasping for air. "Wow," was all Chris could say. Susan smiled, stepped back, and dropped her red dress to the floor, revealing a vintage half-corset bra and French panties, underneath which was a garter belt holding up 15 denier nude stockings. "This is just the beginning, hero. You can do whatever you want to me tonight." Despite the emotions he had experienced, Chris remained steadfast, and Susan's words made him slightly nervous. Chris thought about the meaning of the phrase, "by any means necessary," not fully understanding its intentions, but the thought of closer contact suddenly appeared in his mind. And once this idea appeared, it was difficult to ignore. "Do you want me to take off my bra?" Susan suggested. Chris replied, "No, leave it alone. I want to be closer to you and enjoy the moment. But now turn around and show me your beautiful figure." Susan turned around and twirled herself smoothly, emphasizing her grace under her satin French panties. Chris walked over and patted her softly on the back, enjoying her reaction. "Chris, what if I want to make this a special moment? I'll be glad to hear from you," Susan replied. Chris clarified, "That's great, but actually I want to be closer to you." Susan hesitated. "I never." "So much the better," Chris replied and continued, "You promised. Now let's create our special moment." After a long pause, and to his amazement, Susan did just that. The outdoor stage was mesmerizing. Chris walked up behind Susan, touching her back gently. He carefully positioned himself next to her, moving slowly, feeling the tension of her body. After asking Susan to relax, he gently parted her and moved closer. Susan felt some resistance, but they both decided to proceed with caution. Chris waited for her to recover before taking the next step. The process required patience and mutual trust. "Are you okay, Susan?" asked Chris. "Yes, I think so. Just slow down," she replied. Chris began to move more slowly, and their interaction became more coordinated. After several attempts, Susan was able to relax even more and began to enjoy the moment. They found a common rhythm, feeling closeness and support from each other. Despite the initial difficulties, Chris and Susan were able to achieve harmony, experiencing satisfaction from the moment together. They both collapsed on the floor, exhausted, and then smiled as their eyes met. Susan: "Well, you are full of surprises. I thought that, as an experienced married woman, I would teach you various tricks, but you turned everything upside down." Chris: "It's always good to try something new. Do you think this is for you?" Susan: "I surprised myself. I thought it would be too painful, but it turned out to be very satisfying. Either way, I'm completely exhausted. Do you want to go to bed? That is, just sleep." "Sounds good." They curled up and quickly fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. When Chris woke up the next day, the bed was empty. He found Susan making coffee and chatting on the phone with Helen. She had already heard about the fight and confirmed that Rob was arrested when the police arrived at the bar. Chris heard snippets of Susan's conversation. "Yes, he was a real hero. I think I sorted that out last night. I'm sure he'll be delighted, but I'll ask." No, I better tell the lawyer what happened right away. After the call, Susan offered Chris breakfast. He asked if she had any regrets about last night, to which he received a beaming smile and the answer, I regret absolutely nothing. She continued by explaining that Helen and Jane were now his biggest fans and had invited him to brunch to thank him in person, and once again mentioned the need to meet with her lawyer. Despite the words that there was no need to thank him, Chris came to Helen at 11 o'clock, having heard her shout for him to come in himself. He found Helen and Jane in the living room, dressed in long robes which seemed unusual. Long live the victorious hero. Jane joked, I'm hardly that much of a hero. Chris answered, well, don't be modest. You saved our best friend from that pig of a husband, and we want to thank you. With these words, they simultaneously threw off their robes. Chris froze with his mouth open. They wore sexy maid outfits with bare shoulders and lace chests, with tiny flared skirts and aprons over tiny white petticoats. The skirt did not hide at all the black garters and stockings with a seam at the back, and their legs were emphasized by 15-centimeter high-heeled shoes with a flip-flop. Chris couldn't say a word. They had bought these costumes for a masquerade party years ago, but had realized they were much sexier than they were comfortable with, and had never worn them until Helen remembered them this morning. Helen laughed. Well, hero, are you ready to receive the next prize? With these words, Jane came closer. The maid's costume was clearly at its limit, having difficulty containing her curvy figure. She kissed Chris passionately, and then Helen kissed her. He hugged them both, sliding his hands down and under their petticoats to grab each of their delicious gartered ass. They continued to kiss, barely allowing Chris to catch his breath. Jane noticed how Chris glanced curiously at her figure, smiled, and slightly straightened her clothes, attracting his attention. Helen, seeing this, wondered how to attract Chris's attention and, laughing, decided to act differently. She walked up to him, playfully put her hand on his shoulder, and said, Well, hero, do you have any special wishes? Her tone was slightly mocking, but friendly. Chris, surprised by what was happening, just smiled, not knowing how to answer, and the girls, sensing his embarrassment, exchanged satisfied glances. Chris's head was spinning. It really was his lucky day. I would love to see you kiss each other in front of me. Helen looked at Jane. They had been friends all their lives. She really liked Jane, but she never thought that she could have any interest in women. Helen experimented a lot in college before settling down. This was a chance to reawaken that side of myself. She felt excitement and nervous trembling running through her veins. Jane looked at the friend she loved and smiled. The kiss felt almost natural. She wondered why they had never tried this before. They approached each other and kissed tenderly, holding their faces tenderly in their hands. Chris expected awkwardness, but there was none in his gestures or looks. They continued to kiss, their passion growing by the second. Chris's gaze slid over their faces. He felt a sincere attraction that was in the air. When the kiss broke, both women smiled shyly but joyfully and, holding hands, looked both touching and attractive. Jane invited Chris to join them too. He leaned over, and at that moment a triple kiss happened, tender, memorable, filled with mutual sympathy and trust. Their smiles, glances, and quiet signs created an atmosphere of closeness in which there was no room for embarrassment. Soon Helen suggested moving to a more private place, the bedroom. They helped Chris get comfortable on the bed. There was a slight playful boldness in her voice and gestures, and her eyes shone with a willingness to share a special moment with him and Jane, filled with affection and mutual attention. Jane sat down next to her, positioning herself so that they could look at each other. Helen watched them with a gentle smile, and there was a feeling of complete harmony in the room. Chris felt their closeness growing stronger, not just physically, but also emotionally. Every touch, every look said that they trusted each other and enjoyed the very atmosphere of unity. As Jane and Helen clasped their hands and exchanged glances, it became clear that they were ready to share not only the joy of this moment, but also the general happiness that was in the room. Chris understood that what was happening between them was not just a meeting of desires, but something deeper. Their laughter, sparkling eyes, light whispers, all this formed an amazing puzzle, reminiscent of the fact that true intimacy is born in respect, care, and mutual agreement. In the end, when their touches became even softer and their voices quieter, they disappeared into each other without further words, without fuss. In that silence and warmth that enveloped the bedroom, each of them felt needed, loved, and understood. And this was more important than any words. After a few moments of shared contentment, they collapsed, breathing heavily. Chris joked, "I think you're going to kill me." Helen laughed. "Such a young guy, he has to cope. Besides, you need to recover because Jane craves that gorgeous body." Chris, "I would love to, but maybe we can take a break for a couple of minutes and drink something." Jane replied, "You're already giving up, and it's not even noon yet." Despite the teasing, they actually took a break. Chris enjoyed the sight of Helen and Jane, who were still walking around in their maid outfits. They ate lightly and drank, feeling refreshed. Chris noticed that the two friends kept close, often holding hands and hugging. Helen teased Chris. "What should I do while you're with Jane?" Helen asked playfully, winking at Chris. He thought for a moment, then, smiling, invited both to return to the bedroom. He invited Helen to lie on her back. She wanted to remind him that it was Jane's turn, but Chris stopped her with a light kiss on the cheek and then whispered in Jane's ear, "I want you to please your friend in a way only you know how." Jane was a little embarrassed, but looking at Helen, who looked both gentle and confident, she walked closer to her. Jane began with light kisses, first on the lips, then down to the neck, then even lower, each touch filled with awe and intimacy. Helen sighed quietly with pleasure, and Chris, watching them, felt passion flare up in him. He approached Jane, put his arm around her waist, and they moved in a smooth, common rhythm, filled with mutual trust and emotions. Helen looked at them. She liked to see how Chris and Jane complemented each other, how their closeness reflected in her own feelings. Both girls were gradually approaching their peak of feelings, and Chris followed their mood, trying to maintain harmony between them. When the girls thought that everything was over, Chris, on the contrary, only added confidence and energy. Jane, surprised, looked back at him, and he smiled back. "Let's see who can withstand this rhythm longer." Now their movements have become more bold and relaxed. Jane stood over Helen, who reciprocated, sneaking kisses on her shoulders and chest. Their voices merged into a common symphony of pleasure until they finally reached an emotional climax. Chris poured all his feelings into these moments while Jane happily snuggled up to Helen, and then, exhausted, the three of them rested, lying next to each other. Helen, smiling slightly, wordlessly said with her lips, "Wow." And Jane, almost falling asleep, whispered, "It was better than anything I've ever felt." The following weeks, months, and even years became a new, unusually calm, and at the same time incredibly eventful stage of their lives for Susan, Helen, and Jane. They slowly emerged from the shadows of their previous marriages, becoming more and more convinced every day that the decision they made to put their own interests, feelings, and desires first was the right one. The legal case against their ex-husbands resulted in large compensation payments, which were accompanied by extensive compensation packages and non-disclosure guarantees. The company, trying to restore its reputation, did everything to hush up the scandal and stop the leak of information. As a result, the wives found themselves with means and opportunities that they had previously only dreamed of. Home ownership, bills, investments, now they could afford a quiet life and not depend on men whose business trips once left painful wounds in their souls. But the most important thing they received was freedom. Freedom from expectations and pressure, from the role of keepers of the hearth with disrespectful husbands. They learned an important lesson. Life is too short to waste it on those who do not value or respect you. By reassembling their identities, women did not give up the sexual and emotional freedom they had recently discovered. Their wives' club, once intended as a joke and revenge, has grown into a new definition of relationships and the enjoyment of life. It was an informal union. They met whenever they wanted, organized dinners, parties, weekend trips, rented cottages in the mountains or by the sea, where they could relax and have fun without prying eyes on them. They have long ceased to perceive sex as a duty or a tool to retain a husband. Now it was impeccably honest, mutual pleasure, seasoned with flirtation, humor, and a lack of guilt. Chris, James, and Andy became regular characters at these meetings. Nobody claimed a monopoly or rigid boundaries. The young men realized that they were in a rare and surprising situation. Their partners were mature, wise, knew what they wanted, and did not seek to entangle someone by force. They liked communication, liked the diversity and sincerity that arose between them. Over time, everyone developed their own rhythm. Helen, energetic and confident, remained on the best terms with James, who adored her courage and willingness to experiment. They took up yoga and martial arts together, where Helen was surprised to discover that she could be even more flexible and strong than in her youth. Each of their meetings was accompanied not only by passion, but also by sports excitement, spurring them to new heights. Jane, more reserved and prone to deep feelings, was combined with Andy's tenderness and courtesy. From time to time, they went on small trips together to talk about books, culture, music. They sat by the fireplace in cozy houses, drank hot cocoa, and read poetry to each other. And after these almost platonic evenings, restraint turned into an ardent passion, full of trust and calm. Susan, initially hesitant, was now the glue of this unusual company. She met with Chris more often, admiring his flexibility, sense of humor, and ability to be sensitive when necessary. Their relationship was light, playful, filled with flirting, but also talking about the future. Chris continued his career in his field, tried himself in new projects, and Susan, finally freed from the school teaching routine, took up consulting work in the field of education, developed new methods, and taught teachers how to inspire students. Now she has the time and means to be creative in her life's work. Gradually, the Wives' Club became something more than a group of vengeful girlfriends. It turned into a community of free people who built relationships according to their own rules, without regard to condemnation. They developed a system of conditioned signals and agreements so that no one would have any unpleasant surprises. There was no coercion, no secret intrigues, everything happened openly and with the consent of all parties. A few years after the beginning of this unusual story, Susan was sitting on the terrace of the country house that now belonged to her. Helen and Jane, they had bought it together so that they could have a common sanctuary. It was a wonderful summer evening. Down by the pool, Chris and James and Andy were playing water polo. Mixed teams formed spontaneously, and they determined the winner by the loudest laugh and not by goals. Helen, wearing a luxurious linen sundress, mixed margaritas in a large glass jug. The wind blew her black, stylishly cut hair. Jane, in a pastel-colored dress, leafed through a travel magazine, planning their next trip together. The three of them had long wanted to travel together on a retro train through Europe, stopping in small towns, dining in local taverns, and getting to know life outside the big cities. Susan filled her glass with dry white wine and looked into the distance. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. She felt Chris's hand on her shoulder, who approached unnoticed, hiding a slight smile. He leaned towards her and asked, "What are you thinking about?" Susan turned and looked him in the eye. What if someone had told me 3 years ago that I would be sitting on the terrace of my own house with two best friends and three magnificent young men, my lovers, friends, associates? She smiled and laughed quietly. I would never have believed it. Chris squeezed her hand gently. It's never too late to believe that life can be better than we think. She nodded and took a sip of wine. Down by the pool, Helen and Jane were already pouring cocktails, and James jokingly rushed past, carrying away their towels. Andy emerged from the water and shouted that it was time for everyone to get together for dinner. The evening promised to be long, warm, and filled with laughter, conversation, and touching. Susan, Helen, and Jane, three strong women who had emerged from the yoke of humiliation and betrayal, now lived the way they themselves wanted. They did not seek approval from society. They did not care what decent people thought. They knew that decency is just decoration, and real life opens up to those who are not afraid to rewrite the rules for themselves. And when the stars lit up above their house and the light of the lanterns illuminated the terrace, an invisible spirit of freedom and love seemed to hover over this company. The wind brought the smell of freshness, men laughed, women talked, and it seemed that the whole world had shrunk to this house, this evening, and these people, free and happy in the future they had chosen. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.